Watching News at Prime, let's get into another discussion now. Questions have been raised about the stability of the Government of National Unity as the Democratic Alliance and ANC clash over certain policy positions. The Basic Education Minister, for one, Siviwe Gwarube, last week snubbing President Cyril Ramaphosa's signing of what's now become known as the Bela Act. The DA also opposed to the implementation of the National Health Insurance, which seeks to create universal healthcare coverage for South Africans. Independent analyst is Khaya Sithole, who joins us this evening to talk to us about whether or not the GNU is on stable ground, or could this be that all-important litmus test. Mr. Sithole, good evening to you and thank you for your time. Today, you write in, what is this publication now?
MoneyWeb.
MoneyWeb. Thank you for rescuing me. You write that all honeymoons come to an end. The quick question to you, has the NHI and Bela Act become that litmus test for the stability of the GNU?
Good evening to the viewers. So yes, I think the critical thing about the formation of the Government of National Unity was always the question of what would happen when previously closely held positions come to clash in the form of policy making. So what that means is that obviously in the process of policy making, a particular political party will have a particular view and others will have different views. And in instances where the ANC held a 57.5% majority in parliament, essentially whatever the ANC wanted eventually became law, subject obviously to the obvious public engagements process and the constitutional muster. So what we've always been worried about is obviously at the point in time when laws have to be formed and formulated after the formation of the Government of National Unity, it's not very clear what will happen when political parties refuse to have a meeting of the minds in relation to some of the key issues when they still are forming part of the GNU. So the distinction between the National Health Insurance and Bela is that the National Health Insurance Bill was signed before the Government of National Unity was put into place. In other words, it was a bill that had been conceptualized and crafted when the ANC still had an absolute majority. It had passed its passage through the parliamentary processes and was sitting with the president to sign. So therefore, signing it was simply an endorsement on what the will of the voters reflected at that point in time, because the ANC obviously represented a 57.5% majority at that particular point in time.
Yeah.
The Bela bill, quite interestingly, was not signed, even though the president could have signed it before the general elections. And obviously, now that he's tried to sign it into law, there's been a revival of the old questions about, wait, hold on, you now have parties that have been strongly objected to particular aspects of the bill. Do they now endorse it on the basis that they're members of the GNU, or do they still hold on to their long-held positions and say, even though we're part of this new alliance of government, we are still going to maintain our opposition to this particular aspect of the bill? And what made this one particularly unique is that the minister in charge of then running the department, which then has to adopt the bill, is a minister that comes from the other side, from the Democratic Alliance. So it's an important test for how the Government of National Unity is going to manage conflicts going forward, because this is just the first of many.
Well, I'm glad you touched towards the end of your response there about the resolution of these matters. The threats by some of the GNU partners to walk out of this marriage if they are not listened to. Does that, to you, highlight the urgency with which the resolution mechanism ought to be put in place?
Yes, and I think when we first saw the statement of intent and obviously the deliberations around the formation of the GNU, this was the most obvious and the most pressing question of, wait, what happens when we cannot reach a meeting of the minds? And we saw different permutations. We saw Helen Zille having one interpretation and Philip Mbalula having a very different interpretation of what it meant for these parties that represent a particular electorate to even be part of the same Government of National Unity. Now, since then, we haven't heard much about how the process of actually putting together the guiding principles of the Government of National Unity in relation to conflicts are going to be. And of course, why that is a problem is that this is just one of many instances where there's going to be a divergence of opinion, a divergence of policy orientations, a divergence of political positions amongst parties that form part of the government of national unity. So in the absence of that guiding principle of what ought to happen, you're going to see these particular tensions play out. And of course, it's unfortunate that one party then says, they can walk away and derail the entire alliance, because the reality of it is that I think the way it's been put together, it's unlikely that one party can collapse the entire structure at large. You can imagine that the DA thinks that because it's obviously the biggest of the other parties, it has a much greater influence in the direction of the government of national unity. But I think what President Cyril Ramaphosa has done is that he's made it such an attractive proposition to be part of the government of national unity. Should any party decide to walk away, other parties that probably aren't part of it right now may be taking a keen interest in whether they can form part of that government of national unity. So those threats aren't particularly useful for anyone. And of course, what it does is that it also creates political anxieties and political tensions, because if it then turns out that the president then says, okay, I'm not going to sign this, he's then going to get accused of having capitulated to the wishes of those that don't actually have the electoral muscle to have got that decision in their own. So you can imagine if a 20% party says, if you do this, you're going to walk away, and then you yield, he's going to have much bigger problems going down the line. So that's why it was important for him to sign the bill last Friday.
Yeah. Allow me to ask you this question, which I am going to quickly qualify. How politically sensitive are these new laws? And here's the qualification. Who is likely to count the biggest loss come election time, whether it be through compromising too much or simply being belligerent and forgetting the national interest here?
Look, I think we probably have two or three of, at best, five really contentious pieces of legislation. The NHI obviously being the most obvious of them all, given just how widely spread the opposition to that particular bill was. I think when it comes to this on the Basic Education Law Amendment Act, I think the very polarizing positions were influenced by what the multi-sectional consequences were going to be to the entire architecture and the structure of the education system. And obviously, if you have a primary constituency for whom the system works in one way or another, this is the constituency that's going to say, look, in this one particular instance, we expected you to maintain your position because this isn't just an issue of, a minor hurdle in relation to lawmaking. This is an issue that affects not only us as current voters, but also has a significant impact on the fate of our children, whom we'd like to be treated in a particular way. So you can imagine that a party like the Democratic Alliance needed to maintain the position to its own electorate that, look, we haven't abandoned that particular position. And even though we're part of this particular government, we are going to make it very clear that we're defending your interests, however one defines those, so that when one comes to 2026 and they have to go back to that same electorate and say, we'd like to get your endorsement again, then they have an elegant way of saying, well, actually, even in instances where we did form part of this government of national unity, we did not abandon some of the most closely held issues that matter to you as our voters. So therefore, please do give us another endorsement.
Let's talk about the individual leaders here, or let me say the individual leadership styles. And the reason I'm asking that is that a lot of people are starting to ask questions whether President Ramaphosa is beginning to compromise too much, or if you look at the behavior of the Minister of Basic Education, who is a Democratic Alliance member, there are those who are saying, actually, she should be fired for disobeying authority, because at the end of the day, in government, her boss is the president, and therefore this boycotting of the signing ceremony undermined the authority of the president. But let's start with the president. Do you think President Ramaphosa is firm enough?
We still have this problem with President Ramaphosa, where some of his lethargy is very difficult to explain or even to justify. So if you even look at this bill that is now actually the topic of conversation, last Friday's bill, this is a bill that he could have got over the line before 29 May on the basis that he still had the unilateral ability, if you want to call it that, to essentially say, I've signed this into law on the basis that there's been a public consultation and this is a bill that has been endorsed by a party that represents the majority of the electorate, so therefore it is the view of the public. He could have done that. It's not very clear how he then decided which bills he wanted to sign before the elections and which ones he wanted to hold into the aftermath of the election. So according to Vincent Magwenya, a spokesperson last week Friday, in fact, he has signed 22 bills into law since he belatedly found his pen. So this was a president who understood exactly what was in his intake before the election. We're not very sure how he decided that this is a bill that should be held into the aftermath of this election, and now obviously he has to deal with those particular consequences.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, when we then have to look at how the minister herself firstly put a position that says, look, once
Khaya,
it becomes law, I have no choice but to implement.
You're watching News at Prime. If you're just joining us, we are discussing the stability of the government of national unity in the face of policy positions where the members of this GNU differ greatly to a point where some are even threatening to go to court. Independent analyst Khaya Sithole is helping us here to try and understand the mechanics of this GNU. Let's talk then about the Minister of Basic Education. What's your view of her decision to simply boycott the signing ceremony? Whilst at the same time, she says, I am committed to implementing this law should indeed it become law.
Yeah. So I do think that there was obviously very bad political optics last week. Firstly, the minister did acknowledge that if this is the law of the land, her duty and her responsibility is to implement it for as long as she remains a member of cabinet. What was less difficult to understand, what was less easy to understand, is that she then put out a statement explaining the basis of the boycott, which really gave the impression that she had taken the view that her particular political stance had to be articulated in the strongest possible terms. But of course, that is not something that was unknown. At no point in time did someone think that the DA had suddenly signed up into, all the mechanics of the bill. Their position was well understood. But what we expected to see is that now that you are a member of this government of national unity, you need to be able to understand the mechanics of how decisions are made. And then once a decision has been made, then this is what essentially what one signs up for. So I think her position would have been stronger if we had said, look, these are the rules of engagement in the government of national unity. And in instances when a member or a party that's a member of this alliance disagrees with a particular decision, this is how they communicate it, and this is how we still get the decision done. The way in which it was approached seemed to give the impression that everybody is free to write their own rules. And I think President Ramaphosa has to take some of responsibility here, because as I said earlier on, had he accelerated the process of being very clear about what the rules of engagement are involving political parties that he's now embraced into this government of national unity, then you and I could objectively say that, look, the rules say that in relation to decisions that need to be made where you as a political party hold a dissenting view, this is what ought to happen. So therefore, if you conduct yourself in this way, it is a betrayal of that particular compact or it isn't. At this stage, it's simply a matter of that we think it looked bad, but at no point in time can you objectively say, well, actually, there was a meeting of the minds amongst these parties that should have there be a dissenting view in relation to particular policy formulation, then a member is allowed to sit out the process or to simply say, I dissent, but here I am serving as a member of cabinet, so therefore I will implement regardless of my previously held political position.
Perhaps let's conclude the conversation on the president, seeing that you're saying he has to take part of the blame here. This legislation, this proposed legislation, which is now law because he has signed it, albeit with certain clauses that are where the pause button has been pressed, at least for 3 months. Have you seen an instance where a bill is signed partially? There are certain clauses that are still in question, or is this the first time we are seeing this? And perhaps, again, it goes back to that initial question around the president simply capitulating at the 11th hour.
Look, I think this is obviously quite a unique situation. And what makes it a unique situation is that it's not a president saying, look, I'm going to sign subject to either the lawmakers or somebody else giving me an updated version. So, for example, if you are signing a bill that says, oh, these particular civil servants should get paid a particular number, but that number has been determined 2 or 3 years earlier, then you could say, yes, I agree in principle, but please make sure that the numbers are revised to reflect the current circumstances. So that is one instance where you could essentially say, I'm signing with a caveat, and that would be an acceptable caveat. In this particular instance, obviously, he has then narrowed down to say these are the two most contentious issues in the bill, so therefore I will sign the bill into law and say everything is effective immediately, and the remaining two clauses are subject to this consultation process. And once that consultation process, then I will say, look, the whole bill is in operation. Now, the difficulty here, which I've highlighted in the previous article, is that South Africa still actually doesn't have an answer to the simple question of what happens when you have one very strong but very well synthesized view that is the opposite of what everybody else thinks. So in instances where there is one opposition to a particular clause, whether it's AfriForum or whether it's the DA and everyone else says, well, actually must go ahead, do you then come back and say, well, it was essentially similar to a referendum where so many said yes and only one said no, so therefore it must go ahead? Or do you go through the process of saying, let us look at the substance of the objections and then say, well, actually, we do think that's the case here? The example that I used there is that when we looked at the process of Section 25, when there were deliberations about whether it should be amended, what we saw in the public consultation process is that AfriForum essentially bussed in their members by the thousands. So in every public consultation, they were all represented there. So then you have this particular conundrum where they all essentially showed up and said, we disagree with this bill without putting much substance in why they disagreed. And then somebody or an organization could write a singular comprehensive proposal saying that we must do it. And then the question of how do you balance those two viewpoints is still an unknown one. So in relation to this, we have to be able to figure out a way of saying, okay, when it does come to public consultation, this is the essence of what is being canvassed and what should the answer be? Because the danger here is that in 3 months' time, if the president says I've consulted AfriForum or Solidarity or whatever other organization, and they say that this must be excluded, and then everybody else says, but wait, hold on, when it was an open public consultation process, we said something different, how do you then make the call? That's going to be a very difficult test, and perhaps it's an overdue and an important test for us to be able to understand how do we actually synthesize the multiple and very divergent public inputs into policy making before a decision is made. And I think perhaps this is what the one thing that we can learn from this particular process.
Independent analyst Khaya Sithole, thank you very much for your time and weighing in on this particular issue. All right, that's where we end it for this evening.